You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Coursey.
And welcome to another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. Joining me today as a guest on Wild Things and Wild Places, Scott Talbott, who is the Safari Club International Guides and Outfitters Liaison. Welcome, Scott.
Good morning, Joshua. How are you doing? It's a pleasure to be here.
You have been busy in this position, in this new role of responsibility. Let's talk a little bit about that before we get to some meat and potatoes of what we really want to talk about.
Josh, I started with Safari Club about 18 months ago in the position you mentioned, Guide and Outfitter Liaison. And in that role, it is my responsibility to be a liaison to guides and outfitters, basically internationally to Safari Club International. And our work there is from an advocacy and also a convention standpoint. And we intervene, and our mission, SCI's mission, is first for hunters. And we're an organization that we try to do everything to be first for hunters, whether that's lobbying efforts in Congress, in the European community, Canada, Alaska as well. And certainly part of that has to do with guides and outfitters and how hunters and guides and outfitters work together. Yeah, I have been to Washington, D.C. I've been to Ottawa, Canada, working on legislative issues, and I have assisted our legal team on many legal issues, whether those be trophy ban imports or ESA issues or what have you. Is our convention, which is literally the Super Bowl of all outdoor shows. We have that in Nashville, January 22nd to the 25th this year, and we would certainly invite you and anyone else who has never been there or who has been there to come back. It is an absolutely phenomenal show. Like I said, it's the largest hunting show there is. Lots to see there, everything from optics to hunts and rifles and knives and furs for your wife and jewelry to keep a smile on her face while you're shopping around for all of the stuff that you need to participate in an untold number of outdoor activities. And so I work with a lot of the folks in the convention staff and the outfitting industry to bring those vendors in to the show in Nashville, and it keeps me fairly hopping.
There's probably not a week or a day where you're not busy with a role like that. Of course, SCI and their support of conservation and their advocacy to defend the freedom to hunt from an ever-growing variety of attacks worldwide. I would assume that this role of responsibility has come with probably a new learning experience on a daily or weekly basis for you.
It has, and being a Wyoming resident and have been involved in wildlife and the outdoors in Wyoming my entire life, stepping outside of that realm and stepping into the international realm and traveling to places like New Zealand and Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Namibia, working with those folks and learning about those different cultures and wildlife has been absolutely fascinating. And I've met an untold number of absolutely amazing people along the way. But there's a lot more out there than mule deer and elk and antelope, my friend.
Yeah, boy, it sounds like
It certainly has. It's been very invigorating and very educational. I have learned an unbelievable amount about African wildlife and New Zealand wildlife, different cultures. It's been literally amazing.
When you've had that type of insight and exposure to those type of international hunting communities, any parallels or significant contrast of differences from what we know and hold dear to our heart as Western United States hunters? What stands out to you that was just eye-opening?
Oh, probably the biggest shocker that came to me worldwide is the North American model of wildlife management. And those pillars in North American wildlife management: equal access to wildlife and not using wildlife for commercial values and those types of things. Josh, we have in Wyoming one of the purest systems of wildlife management, and that being access to our wildlife and distribution of that wildlife to the public as there is anywhere in the world. Looking at wildlife management models throughout the world that I have been exposed to, and not that there are some out there that I'm not aware of, but the ones I have seen, the data collection, the data analysis, the effort that goes into monitoring wildlife populations and ensuring that they're properly managed, I don't see those efforts to that degree. And there's obviously folks that are doing a lot of great work on migrations on animals throughout the world and population structures throughout the world, but not to the extent that you see it right here at home. And you and your organization have been very involved in a lot of migration work and deer elk competition work and those types of things. And that work goes on in other places in the world, but not like it does here. I have to really look at what Wyoming has done, and many of the other states as well. But what North America has done with wildlife management, the priority that's been placed on it, the funding mechanisms that have been put in place for wildlife management, and like no place in the world. We have a system of wildlife management that is head and shoulders above anything else that I have seen.
Fascinating. I think when you talk about the sciences of wildlife management, whether that's biological, political, or social, I'm sure that there are many of those issues on a global scale or international scale that have overreaching influences or similarities. When you talk about the social or political sciences of wildlife management, and certainly with the North American model of wildlife conservation, there are some stand-up pillars within what we do on our continent that maybe aren't done elsewhere. But on the social and political sciences, what are some of the issues that maybe would not resonate with folks that live in North America that are going on in other places?
And probably the one that is first and foremost right in front of us is privatization of wildlife. In Wyoming, there's no privatization of wildlife. There are in some other states, but worldwide privatization of wildlife is very common. And that is a huge cultural change right there. And the name of the podcast, Wild Things in Wild Places. The migrations of big game animals, those types of things, those are not all that common in the rest of the world. Obviously, there's some in Canada and Alaska and North America, but you don't see that in a lot of the rest of the world.
Very interesting. Yeah. You don't know how good you have it until you go somewhere else.
Yeah, and I'm very proud of the system that Wyoming has implemented over the last 150 years. And those systems work for those jurisdictions, and they have found programs that work for them. Not that they don't work. They're just very different than ours.
What a great experience you've had in 18 months already just to be able to see some of that. I'm curious, Scott, what are some of the things back home that continue to resonate with hunters and sportsmen and sportswomen? And what are some of the issues that need to be at least prioritized to be right front and center for folks to be thinking about and knowing that their engagement and their issues and efforts are still very much needed? Even though we have a great system here, there are still many things that we have challenges and obstacles ahead of us that we need to be paying attention to.
Obviously, one of the things that you and I have talked about many times in the past is just public engagement. People need to be engaged in the issues that are going on right here. The popularity of hunting in North America, and specifically the western states, Wyoming, is no exception. Wyoming might be the exception of one of the most popular places in the West to hunt. People need to be engaged in the issues, and they need to be engaged in wildlife management. They need to take an active part and an active role in that. One of the one of the things that I'd like to visit with you about today is the step-down plan for the National Elk Refuge and what that process is going to do and how we're going to move forward with that. And certainly Safari Club International is very interested in that process, and we have been involved in it. And I would certainly encourage people to, if they're interested in elk and elk hunting in western Wyoming, that they need to become engaged in that issue. That's an issue that could have some pretty significant impacts to people in Wyoming as we move forward into the future.
Yeah, I think the consequences of that, the foresight of the potential consequences of what those closures could invoke and propose problems on private lands, competition with other species. We've certainly been an advocate for the system that we have now. While it certainly has its flaws and its origin or roots of what created that, we've created this problem, but to just shut it down and walk away from it, that's a tall order, and there are many impacts that come from that maybe need to be highlighted that we're mindful of. But I am mindful of something that you and I had a discussion on years ago on a fencing project at the Pathfinder Ranch. And you had told me, of course, as the director of Game and Fish at that time, you had indicated to me that moving forward as a young conservation group, that an issue that we would be dealing with, tackling, facing, and needing to be out in front as much as we could, that it would define our efforts over the next couple decades, was chronic wasting disease. And boy, hasn't that proven to be true.
Oh, Josh, chronic wasting disease. The National Institute of Health came out in the last number of months with a study survey that shows that the transferability between species, the species barrier on those diseases, those TSE diseases, especially chronic wasting disease, those species barriers are very strong. And that's the best news that we've had on chronic wasting disease that I'm aware of, and since the discovery of it, everything about chronic wasting disease just seems to be getting more and more desperate. When you and I talked about chronic wasting disease, we were looking at questioning whether there was actually population effects from chronic wasting disease. Very much lower infections rates than there are today. And if you look at some of the infection rates in Wyoming and also Saskatchewan right now, obviously that disease is having significant impacts on deer populations. Saskatchewan is seeing a number of moose that are coming down with chronic wasting disease. And as you're well aware, there's a lot of studies that have been going on with that, and we continue to learn a lot. But no, chronic wasting disease is not something that we want to deal with.
Safari Club International, I assume, is also a great organization that is putting out information to its members, to its outreach capabilities, to just bring the awareness that is needed and the significance of the consequences of CWD?
Absolutely, and the foundation portion of SCI is actually sponsoring some chronic wasting disease studies themselves. So SCI is very interested in the future of chronic wasting disease and how we successfully can hopefully manage our way through CWD. And there's still a lot to be learned about the disease, and we continue to learn a lot on a regular basis. And certainly the infection rates in deer continue to climb, and we're not seeing the same level of infectivity in elk populations. One might be able to say that is more of a disease of deer than it is elk. It will be interesting to see what happens in Saskatchewan with moose. They have a number of positive moose they documented last year, but certainly the disease at this point appears to be more of a deer disease than elk or moose or other cervid species. Yeah, mule deer and whitetail deer seem to be carrying the brunt of that disease.
When you talk about the impacts to population levels, there are landscapes that just seem to be removed of critters that historically dominated those landscapes when you talk deer. mule deer and whitetail. It's taken its toll. But when you talk about feed grounds, that tends to be on the surface an isolated topic that is revolving around elk. But when you talk about deer and the consequences of the closure, the step down of the National Elk Refuge, that is another variable or another impact that could potentially pose significant consequence to mule deer populations in western Wyoming.
There's no doubt, and under the step-down plan and the structured decision-making process that we participated in May, there are 5 alternatives, and one alternative is status quo, and the other 4 alternatives all include reduction of supplemental feed on the refuge. And Josh, we've had the National Elk Refuge in place and named the National Elk Refuge since 1912. We have a huge data set there of when we have to feed, when we don't have to feed. Mild winters, we feed less. Heavier winters, we feed more. But congratulations to the National Elk Refuge. They've done a pretty good job at increasing forage on the National Elk Refuge, provide natural forage to those elk. But you and I both know that Jackson Hole is an area of deep snow. 2 of the most popular ski areas in North America are located right there, and that's a pretty good indicator that sometimes it can snow pretty decent in Jackson. And no matter how much forage we produce, if it's under 4 feet of snow, it's not available to those elk. And elk are an animal that you're well aware is pretty aggressive from a habitat use perspective. And if they're fenced in, if they're cornered, if they're in places where they don't have feed, they will do just about anything they can to find a place to forage. From that perspective, they're a very robust animal, and they'll be eating aspen trees or forage out of people's yards or ornamental shrubs and bushes, what have you. They have very general diet. They can be grazers, they can be browsers, but they're just like any animal. They don't really like to starve to death. And if they move off of that refuge and seeking forage, certainly those remnant deer that winter in Jackson Hole on the Grove Buttes, the competition between deer and elk, there's no doubt that those elk are going to win that contest.
Yeah, that's a point that we've tried to bring to light to many folks, particularly when the state was looking at some of the state-owned feed grounds and some of those considerations to be front and center as well. But then what about private property damages? I would think as sportsmen and sportswomen, that would be another concern, and more so with state-owned feed grounds as well. When you look at the National Elk Refuge, if those elk are displaced, as you said, elk are resilient. They're going to eat. Nothing is going to put more energy and effort into being able to maintain its persistence of life than finding a way to feed itself in its need. But I would think the consequences for sportsmen and sportswomen across the board on a financial basis is something to also be aware of.
Josh, you're correct. And the state has a number of feed grounds, and those feed grounds were mostly implemented many decades ago to reduce conflicts with private land and livestock and management of disease, particularly brucellosis. And if those supplemental feed is not provided to those animals, they're going to find someplace else to go. And when they do that, whether that be in downtown small town Wyoming or in a feed line with Rancher X's cows or in somebody's haystack or in somebody's horse corral eating the hay that people have put out for their horses, those elk are going to do their best to keep their stomachs full. And there comes a whole litany of problems associated with that. One is the property destruction, whether they're tearing down fences, personal safety, if they're crossing those highways in the middle of the winter where they're moving, trying to find forage and being hit by cars and destroying cars, destroying elk, and potentially significant safety risks to humans. Obviously, if they're in haystacks, the financial obligation to pay for those damages is there. Yeah, providing supplemental feed is certainly not the preferred management alternative. But when we have come into Wyoming and we have developed places like Jackson Hole, we continue to develop winter ranges in western Wyoming, whether that be in Pinedale or Big Piney or along the Alpine front, the Star Valley. The more and more of that native winter range that we take away from them, the fewer opportunities that we give them to forage naturally. We have some tough decisions to make. Are we going to try to maintain those elk populations through supplemental feeding and support, or are we going to ultimately reduce those populations to what limited or non-existent winter range may be left?
Scott, when did this get on your radar, shortly taking on this new detail with SCI? When did this become something that you wanted to prioritize to continue to engage and rally folks to be aware of how significant this issue is?
And we started working on this last May, and we participated in the process. And I would throw out a website, Josh, for anybody who's interested in looking at the process, and I don't know that I'll go through it in great detail right now, but you can go into www.fws.gov/NER-BEMP. And that is the website for the National Elk Refuge Bison Elk Management Plan. And you can look at that process. Bison Elk Management Plan, the step-down plan, managing elk and bison on the National Elk Refuge is not a new issue. This is just a revision of the plan and what the service is trying to do with the management of the refuge. And obviously, the Jackson elk herd, most of it winters on the National Elk Refuge. And in 2023, there were just over 9,000 elk that spent their winter out there. That population is down. Just back into about 1986, you had nearly 19,000 elk in that population. And certainly there were elk that were wintering out more than. The introduction of wolves has certainly changed the winter distribution of elk in the Jackson area. And Game and Fish and Forest Service and others have done millions of dollars worth of habitat restoration in places like the Grovant and other places. And on years, lighter snow years, there was a number of those elk that actually could winter out. As a matter of fact, if you look at the records, there's years that in the Grovant, feeding never even took place because of lack of snow. That's very seldom. It does happen, but it's seldom. And so there's this combination of snow depth and forage availability that's monitored in the whole process. As we move forward in this process and we examine the options that were put forth and the alternatives, certainly we feel that looking into other migration areas, as we mentioned earlier, private land, is there opportunities where we can work with private landowners? Is there opportunities where we can do more work with federal land management agencies? And we just like to make sure that all of the potential options are fairly evaluated. And back in 1944, there was a report written on the National Elk Refuge, and it was quoted as Jackson Hole elk might be the most complicated wildlife management issue in the world. it's complicated. It's not easy. There's a lot of things that we need to look at. There's a lot of things that can be done. There's some things that can't be done. But we feel that we just need to continue to look at those options and do the best that we can to maintain that elk population in Jackson Hole, not only for hunters, but for elk enthusiasts and tourists and business folks and people like you and I who just love wildlife, Josh.
Yeah, that article you said that came out in 1944, that 80 years later, we're still dealing with the challenges and the nuances associated with this. What, Scott, could you offer up for individual sportsmen and sportswomen? What can the individual hunter or wildlife enthusiast, what role can they play within this effort, in this process?
We just talked about that a few minutes ago, Josh, and you and I have talked about that in the past many times. People need to be engaged. That website, go on that website, and when the public comment portion of this process comes open, step up and have your voice heard. And express your opinion and be engaged in that process. And the process is going to go on, and hopefully people will be involved in it. And folks will participate and be fully informed of the issues and have their voices heard.
Scott, any idea on the time frame of when you think that public comment period, is there a window of an opportunity where that might be made public? When do you expect that to happen?
On the website, Josh, they say that January through March of next year that they will be doing public comments on the plan. Again, that's on the website, but they're in the process of developing they did the community engagement earlier this year, and they're developing their draft plan, and I believe that it's out for public comment scheduled January through March, and perhaps they'll release a draft this fall. But if they can get on that website, they can look that up, and when it becomes available, hopefully folks will take a look at it and get engaged in the issues.
Yeah, that's certainly something we'll be following. We'll certain to include the link of that website within the release of this podcast as well. Do as Scott has asked, just to familiarize yourself, educate yourself, be aware of the process. There's a lot of moving parts to this. It's a bureaucratic, slow-moving machine, but it does have a place where every individual voice can be heard, and that is very important. And this is a clarion call, if you will, to make sure you put that effort to be involved and engaged, because that carries great merit in the ultimate decision that comes down. Scott, what else on this feed ground topic did you want to cover that we have not got to? Is there something else that you think is important that we just need to be made aware of?
Josh, to me, growing up in Wyoming, Jackson was always the land of the elk. And when I was a young man growing up in Wyoming, I always wanted to go to Jackson and hunt elk because of the famous Jackson Hole elk herd. And I never did that as a young man. I didn't go to Jackson to hunt until I was, I would say, mid-age at best. But that's part of our culture. It's part of who we identify ourselves as a state, is Jackson Hole and the elk. And anyway, I hope that we can always do that and be proud of how we manage that population.
Hey, thank you in advance for the efforts on this already. Those to come, thank you for your affiliation and the new role that you have with Safari Club International. Everybody is, particularly in Wyoming, when you talk to folks and their engagement and involvement with conservation groups, they tend to be more localized or more continentally based. But when you talk about something as big as Safari Club International and their efforts to protect hunting and to conserve wildlife around the world, there is a place for you to be supporting both hunting and conservation through SCI. As someone who lives in Wyoming, knowing that its impact and its reach, it is all about a numbers game, and the power and the ability to have influence and to be able to be at the seat of the table of decision. SCI has really put itself in a very unique position of great notoriety and great credibility and respect. What have you seen or been exposed to with your 18 months so far with SCI that really just makes a great call for folks to give consideration to supporting SCI as a member in the work that it's doing?
Josh, I have always been, I guess, if you will, the outer skirts of SCI. When I was working, often we would call them up and they would provide us financial assistance with small things like decoys or some funding for elk populations or deer surveys when we needed a little financial help. And I always appreciated that. But to be quite honest with you, I had no idea the width and depth of SCI until I went to work for them. We have 2 state liaisons that communicate with the states every day. And we have federal liaisons that are working on the Hill every day. We have the Hunter's Embassy, which is within walking distance of the Capitol. We have people working with Congress every day. And we have a scheduled event each year. It's called Lobby Day. This year for Lobby Day, we invited SCI members from chapters throughout the United States to Washington, D.C. And in one day, we talked to over 100 representatives and senators in one day about issues affecting sportsmen. And whether that be access to federal land, whether that be lead on public lands, what have you. We talked to them about lots of issues, state-specific issues, and we took those Safari Club members with us and introduced them to our senators and congressmen right there. A lot of those as the first time they'd ever been to Washington, D.C., first time they'd ever met their congressional staff. An amazing process. And talked to our government officials and our members about issues that face sportsmen each and every day. And so that's an amazing process. The state issues and what we're talking about with the National Elk Refuge is certainly a state issue. We're working on some overtime issues on federal lands and federal land operators right now to help hunting guides and outfitters as far as some constraints that have been placed on them by the Department of Labor. And so we're working on stuff like that each and every day. And whether it would be supporting Wyoming in the grizzly bear lawsuit or working in Florida to implement the first bear season for the Florida black bear, or whether it be sandhill crane seasons in another state, we are working on something every day in the United States, and our crew is there. In addition to that, we have our legal staff, and we have 8 attorneys, full-time attorneys for SCI that are litigating sportsmen's issues around the globe each and every day. And they do some very impressive work. We have folks in Europe, we have folks in Africa. And when you talk about Safari Club International, it is truly Safari Club International. And we're doing everything we can to support hunters and hunting.
Listening to what just was explained by Scott doesn't give you enough reason to consider a membership or support of SCI. Go to their website, safariclub.org, and look at the activeness of this organization. It's very far-reaching, and with a name like Safari Club International, it does it full justice. It is truly globally, but the work that is going on at the local level, or whether that be states or just within the United States, there is a ton of good work going on, and it's needed.
And just for folks' information, I'm talking about Safari Club International and the actual, if you would, the foundation organization of Safari Club. In addition to that, and portion of that foundation is the chapters. For example, in Wyoming, we have the Central Wyoming chapter of SCI. It's here in Casper. And so they have fundraisers, they do their activities, and they generate a significant amount of money. The chapters around, I believe there's 155 chapters in the world right now. And those chapters do their own fundraisers. Obviously, they support Safari Club International, the organization, but they keep a significant portion of the money that they they raise, and they spend it on local projects. And whether that be local game and fish projects or local hunting range projects or youth projects or providing opportunities for disabled veterans or those types of things. But there is a whole different leg of Safari Club in those chapters that those folks work primarily on local issues. The Central Wyoming chapter of Safari Club, they spend all of their time and effort working on Wyoming issues. They're certainly very supportive of SCI National, but their focus is on local gun ranges and helping promote hunting on a local level. It's not just all about national. There is a lot going on with the chapters, and if anybody would be interested in starting a chapter or anything like that, they'd be more than welcome to call me, and I could get them set up with our membership folks, and we'd be very happy to help someone start a chapter here in Wyoming.
And again, I think it's important for folks to understand that there really are two arms to this. The SCI, which is really the only hunting rights organization, am I correct, with a Washington, D.C. based national and yet international advocacy team? Is that right? And then the foundation, which is more the local level, chapter-based, support research, wildlife management, conservation projects, etc. Two different arms of this, but both very important and complement each other very well.
Absolutely. SCI is the organization to advocate for hunters and hunting. And those local chapters help their local communities. And then SCI National, quite frankly, we try to do it all. And it's pretty impressive, all the things that get addressed when you sit down and visit with folks from all over the world.
Very good info, Scott. And again, just to remind folks, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, SCI's annual Hunters Convention, the world's ultimate sportsman's market that celebrates our freedom to hunt with world premier outfitters, hunting celebrities, gear. If you're a gear junkie, this is the show. And that date has already been announced for next year. It's in Nashville. And that's January 22nd through the 25th. And I'm sure you'll be there, right, Scott?
I'll be there. I will be there. For those who have not been able to attend, Josh, it is an amazing show.
Yeah, I have not myself been there, but yeah, that is something I would like to be able to do. When you can get that many hunters in one place together, it's bound to be a good time.
It is a good time.
All right, Scott. Anything else that we haven't touched on? It was great to catch up with you. It sounds like what you're doing is very fulfilling, and every day is providing new opportunities and new challenges for you to tackle head on. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure to catch up with you and visit with you, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, sounds great. Wild Things and Wild Places, Scott Talbott visiting about Safari Club International, some important work that's being done, and it's not necessarily all global. There is some efforts that are right here in your own backyard, particularly with stuff that you need to be mindful of that's got a looming presence, and that is the Elk Feedgrounds and your ability to engage within that issue as an individual, to make your voice heard, and to keep what has been a very valued heritage and culture for those that live in western Wyoming, and what those elk feed grounds provide, some of the unintended consequences if they were not managed and operated the way they are today, to be mindful of. Talking with Scott Talbott, SCI.
Thank you, Josh.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.